Welcome to our fourth Land to Lake lecture series with the Cannon River Watershed Joint Powers Organization. I'm Ryan Lerman. I am the Rice and Steele County Extension Educator for Agriculture and Natural Resources. I want to let everybody know this webinar is being recorded. Everybody that did sign up, you will get a link with the recording at some point after we're done here. If you have any questions during the presentation, use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to answering those after all the presentations are done. For today's webinar, we're going to talk about nitrate risks in the Karst region, and we have Ben Dvorak from Goodhue SWCD joining us, and he's going to represent the Cannon River Watershed Joint Powers Organization. And we also have our main speaker, who is Martin Larsen from the Olmsted Soil and Water District. With that being said, I'm going to kick it over to you, Ben, to start us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, my name is Ben Dvorak, and I am the Natural Resource Specialist in Goodhue. And so I handle contract stuff and wetland things, but then also part of mine is water and well testing and everything in Goodhue County. So I will first share this guy, and I will just go over, one sec, there we go. All right, can everybody see that? Hopefully they can. So yeah, here's just a couple pictures. This is just a little presentation I put together about what the Cannon River Watershed Joint Powers Organization does. And so you can see in that picture on the right where the Cannon River is. So here is kind of a map of the plan, and you can see on there the counties that it goes through. So we've got Goodhue, a little bit of Dakota, a lot of Rice County, a lot of Steele County, Waseca, and LeSueur County. And so then divvied up in that watershed, there are different priority areas that are all based on some of the tributaries, some of the lakes, some of the groundwater sensitivity, that kind of thing. And all of that kind of plays into how funding is divvied up for different projects in the watershed. Here's just a little info about the watershed. So it's almost 1 million acres. It's mostly agricultural, just by a little bit, and it kind of depends on what county you're in. But it is a lot of agriculture though, and that's where a lot of our projects are. There's two main rivers, Cannon and Strait, and then there are a lot of lakes, also mostly on the west side of the watershed. And you can see Rice and Steele and Goodhue make up the majority of it. Projects that we do in the watershed. So most of them are all, oh, am I still sharing? What did I do? There we go. Most of them are in order to fix erosion. So you can see pictures on here of rill erosion, gully erosion, wind erosion. Pretty much we don't want soil leaving the landscape is kind of the moral of the story. Oops. Oh, and now I can't. Hang on. Hmm. 1 second. This again. There we go. So erosion control. So what do we do to stop this? So we can put in grass waterways, sediment and control basins. Those are just different ways to slow down the water. And those are mainly structural. And then we do have non-structural things, which would be like cover crops, no-till, conservation tillage, strip tillage, that kind of thing. That's where a lot of the funds go that are used in the watershed. The funds also go towards outreach and education. So Teresa, who kind of runs this webinar, she does a really great job of planning events. throughout the watershed. And usually this time of year, we don't have as many events. But in the summer, spring, there's always farm visits, bus tours, that kind of thing to go over what are issues going on in the watershed. One of the other things we do is water quality. So there are lots of lakes in the Cannon River watershed. And there we pay for shoreline surveys. There's inventories of septic systems around lakes. And then there are other things that do with streams, stream bank erosion. Minimizing that is also a top priority. And then we also do, which is kind of more aimed at what we're talking about today, are well testing and sealing. So there are testing clinics that are almost all spring, summer, and fall going on in the watershed. A lot of them are at fairs and different events. And we have money that goes towards that, and then also well sealing. So old wells that are no longer used, it's always a good idea to get them sealed so that they are not a source of contamination into the groundwater. And then there's also money that goes towards shoreline restorations on mainly lakes, and doing flower plantings, native grass plantings, that kind of thing is definitely something that we put money towards. And then one last little thing I always just like to talk about is we have Billsby Dam, which is just west of Cannon Falls. And I just think it's kind of a cool thing in the watershed. Probably about over 2/3 of the water goes through that dam before it goes out into the Mississippi River, and I just think that's kind of a cool aspect of the watershed. And that's run by Dakota County, and I believe now they fixed it a bunch and got it all updated, and it is generating power again, which is pretty cool. So yeah. Anyways, I will turn it over to Martin then, and I'll be back after he's done to talk about some other things.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm Martin Larsen. I work for the Olmsted County Soil and Water Conservation District. This is my 15th year, actually, 14th year with the district. I also farm within Olmsted County and Mower County. It's a multi-generation farm. That's my son in the photo there with me. And depending on which generations you count, we're the sixth of the Larsen family and the eighth of the Amundsen family, who've always been on the Amundsen farm is where we live now. And so pretty proud to be able to have him in the farm in the field with me. It's kind of what we all strive to do as farmers is to work with our kids, I think. And that's a basis for a lot of the reason why I take conservation so seriously is that I feel like I want to hand that farm down to him in better condition than I got it in. And that's what real conservation or real regenerative ag is. I also got interested in karst and groundwater as a hobby and going caving and being part of the Minnesota Caving Club. But then also at my job with dye tracing and finding those groundwater pathways. So this is a pretty basic, uh, a basic, I did the same thing. Stuff's in the way of my presentation, so I was trying to move it around, right? Okay. So karst topography is a unique landscape formed by the dissolution of soluble bedrock like limestone with slightly acidic water, creative distinctive features such as caves, sinkholes, underground streams, and springs. So when we think of karst, we think of those features that we see or can go into like caves. We see sinkholes on the landscape, but sometimes it's hidden too. So it's underneath 25 feet of soil or more. And we still have karst aquifers that we're drawing our water from to drink, but it's a little hidden. We don't always see those features. So it's how common is it? Well, it's actually quite common. On the left-hand side there we have a map of the United States and where you find carbonate rocks or other types of rock that can be karstic, like gypsum. And the sinkholes are mapped there also. So you can see across Florida or Kentucky, large swaths of sinkholes. And if you look in southeast Minnesota there, you see our so-called sinkhole capital of the world, which would be Fillmore County and the town of Fountain. So if we look at southeast Minnesota, we're calling active karst, where we have less than 50 feet of ground cover over that limestone. Then there's some transitional karst and then covered karst. Uh, so that's a pretty good illustration of where we find that active karst, or we probably going to find caves, those karst springs and those sinkholes in Minnesota. Most of our rock was created in the Middle Ordovician period. So if we think of our large cave systems in Minnesota, they're predominantly found in the Galena group, and so, some just getting right into the Spillville. But our large caves are in the Dubuque system, the longest. And then there's the river caves, which are down in the Cummingsville and Prosser. So if you're familiar with Highway 52 south of Rochester, the 52 rock cut right by the mall there goes through the Decorah Cummingsville contact. So when you're first coming into that, you'll see that Decorah shale outcrop with the Cummingsville rock above it. If you look on the right-hand side of the slide, that's our timeline, right? So if you look way down, kind of towards the bottom, almost of the timeline, where you see that Ordovician period, that's when our North America was covered by a shallow sea. And here's some examples of the life that was in that sea that was part of the creation of that sea floor. When it died, settled out, created our limestone, right? So how our limestone, which is underneath varying levels of layers and thicknesses of soil, interacts with water, I kind of divided into two different interaction, right? So there's runoff that enters sinkholes, and then there's leaching below the cropping zone that leaches into the groundwater. So if you think of runoff, which this video is taken in spring during spring snowmelt runoff, and that runoff is entering Goliath sinkhole. So anything that's in that runoff, it could be manure contaminated runoff or soil loss that enters open conduits. It's carried in through flow like this, like a stream. So as soon as that stream enters the cave system, it pretty much looks the same as it does on the land surface, except it's flowing through a cave system. Once it's in that cave system, it doesn't alleviate it from being pulled back out through a well, right? So in this photo in the upper right, we have this column. It appears to be a column that's through the ceiling of the cave and then through the floor of the cave. That's actually a well that was drilled directly through a cold water cave in northern Iowa. And obviously anything that's running or flowing through that cave is likely to be drawn out with that well. On the left photo, that's a spring outside of Fountain, Minnesota. It's Fountain Big Spring. And the white in that photo is actually lime dust that was washed off the floor of a nearby quarry that entered the conduits in the quarry floor. When we think nitrates, I think more of the matrix of the rock itself. And I think The Matrix is like a popular movie, but in this case, it's the pore space of the rock itself. And when we think of aquifers that we draw water from through our drinking water wells, we're predominantly extracting water from the pore space of the rock. That's um, the yield of the aquifer is stored within the openings of the rock itself, and they're pretty microscopic. So that center photo, that's a view of our limestone bedrock through a microscope, and we can see those pore spaces in there. And when we're inside a cave on the right-hand side there, you'll see a drip of water coming out of a soda straw. And the soda straw is the very beginning of a stalactite or a cave formation that forms from the ceiling of a cave. So when I talk later about sampling from cave drips, that's a good example of where I'm collecting that water from, which is the cave drips themselves. And nitrates, once they are in groundwater, there's no known natural removal system for that nitrate. So nitrate will not be filtered out through soil or rock or sand. It's an anion, so it stays with that water for many years, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. So not in our lifetime will it be removed once it's in the bedrock that we pull our water from. So when we're on the land surface and we're farming, this is what we see, right? I'll see it from my tractor cab. You'll see it from the road or out in the field yourself, right? So this is a hay field. It's outside of Eyota, Minnesota. And it was taken in year 2023. So if we remember back to 2023, it was a drought year. And hay or alfalfa plants have a very deep rooting structure. They're actually very good for nitrate reduction. They're good for it's good for soil health. Hay is a very good thing to have on the landscape. Now, if we were to put a drone up, my coworker did, and we were all out in the field. He had the drone license, so he put the drone up in the air, and we looked at that field from the air. You see those darker lines within that hay field, and that's actually the fracturing of the rock itself. So if we back up in Earth's time or geologic time to when the ocean created the rock to today, there's folding of the plates of our crust, Earth's surface, and that folding likely created these regular fractures in the rock that are pretty much predictable in direction, and they're repeatable in how far apart they are. So here we can see we're actually looking west in this photo. So these are almost straight east and west fractures. And when that water from the land surface moves down into the bedrock, it picks the fractures or preferentially flows into the fractures of the rock first. And that slightly acidic water starts to dissolve those fractures back. And what fills the fracture in many cases is soil and clay. Well, that alfalfa has more water available to it in that fracture area, creating these fracture traces. So it stays greener for a longer period of time during drought conditions. So it's a good example of how hidden our drainage system is. That's pretty shallow soil when we can pick up that fracture trace and it looks this picturesque. When we look at road cuts, it's a good cross section of what that system looks like. So up on top, you can see that shallow soil. And then right here, if you see my mouse towards the center of the photo, you'll see that fracture, and that staining is actually where the preferential flow of water is occurring. So this is actually in a Prairie du Chien rock. It's up by Lake Zumbro. So it starts to look a little bit like this when we start to model groundwater flow. We have fractures that control, in many cases, some fracture flow, but we also have the porous space of the rock as well. So we actually call it the 3D groundwater flow. That would be the fractures, the bedding planes, and the pore space of the rock itself. And every pore space or fracture or matrix has a different flow rate. So some water is very old, it's stored in the bedrock a long time, and other water is young and moves quickly through the system. So if we think about nitrates and when are the marker years for nitrates, we really got to look at the 50s. And the reason that we look at that time frame, there's a couple of things. One, we know that it was probably 1950s water because we start to pick up tritium in post 1950s water. And where do we get tritium from in our water? Atomic bomb testing. And we know that that started to occur in the 1950s. And one thing that started to occur, or really started to occur more quickly, is the loss of diversity in the landscape. So this is a county in northern Iowa. This was actually a pheasant study that was done. I found this study. It's pretty interesting to read about. I found this area on the map. I'm going to redo this and add a 2025 slide here. I just need to get that done. But this is the diversity that we saw in the landscape in 1941. So if you look at the colors of the map, you can see that we have idle ground, hay ground, oats, a little bit of corn. Of course, we see green out there, a little bit of soybeans, a lot less. We got pasture, farmsteads, trees, marsh, and wet meadow. So it's a very colorful map. And of course, for me, and being interested in growing oats, look at all that yellow out there, right? And this is 1976. So this is bracketing those 19 years of the 1950s. But still, 1976 was quite a while ago when we think about where we are today in agriculture. And when you look at this area now, the only colors on this map are gray for soybeans. You have to excuse me if that is not gray because I'm colorblind, and green for corn. Except for this far upper right section, the Iowa DNR bought 80 acres in that, and that is now permanent meadow. But other than that, there's only corn and soybeans, and even a few more of the farmsteads are gone. So Justin Watkins did this work in southeast Minnesota where he studied bedrock-dominated watersheds. So bedrock-dominated means that most of the water within that stream comes from a spring. So trout streams, right? So springs are groundwater emerging into that stream. And he looked upstream of that sampling point, and this is not a small number of samples. It's 100 samples. And in his data, he found that once the catchment area, so that all the land above the point at which he took that sample, contained 60% or higher row crops, it was very predictable that groundwater nitrate concentration or nitrate concentration within that stream surpassed 10 parts per million. So in that 50 to 60 parts per million, it's a very good fit statistically that you will see water above 10 parts per million, which is the drinking water standard. So if we look at cave drip sampling, and this is just one good example that I like to use. I have a lot of other examples, but this is like a black and white example where if we look at Holy Grail Cave, we go in the ground and we collect water from the ceiling. If you are under long-term grassland or conservation reserve program ground, you will see nitrate concentrations near zero. If you go underneath the nearby corn and soybean fields, you will find nitrate concentrations above the drinking water standard. I've not found an anomaly to this yet. In this example, out in that corn and soybean ground, the cave drip was 17 parts per million. I've seen them range from 10 to 30 underneath row crops in caves. So we think back to that land use map, right? So this is a spring, it's Bear Spring, it's east of Rochester. We've studied it for a long time now. And if we start to look at the land use of that spring shed, so the land surface that contributes to that spring, and we plug in expected nitrate values, and we find these values through our lysimeter network, through our tile water sampling networks, and we're actually pretty good at knowing, and I can get into that data a little bit in the next couple of slides, what we would expect in that given year from a cornfield or a soybean year. And if we plug that into our land use, we can predict that that spring should have about 19 part per million. This is strictly math, so I've got it to the tenths. Because 71% of that spring shed was planted to corn and soybeans in 2018. So if we look at the actual data, this is data that's collected every 15 minutes. The red line is nitrate concentration. And during base flow period of time, which is on the left side of this graph, you actually see that that spring has a base flow nitrate concentration between 19 and 20 parts per million. So it fits very well. It is not very often that that does not fit when you look at land use. Is it row crops? What's the expected nitrate concentration? I use this example with farmers during the 24 hours period of June 28th in 2017. This spring discharged 63 pounds of nitrogen per hour, because if we have flow, which we do every 15 minutes, how much water is coming out of the spring and the concentration of the nitrates within that water, we can do a loading calculation. And at that year, it was $35 an hour. If you were to buy nitrogen fertilizer today to replace that, it's closer to $70 an hour. And that's just one spring in southeast Minnesota. So there's a real financial incentive to be able to keep that nitrate within the rooting zone where it can be used for our crops. So this is the Olmsted County lysimeter data. There's 640 water samples represented here. It's actually 2, 4, 6 years of data. And I'm going to summarize this as quickly as possible, but this is each growing year layered on top of one another. So if you look at the bottom, the x-axis is the growing week of the year. So we're starting about May 1st and we're ending about October 1st, if we look from left to right. On the y-axis is nitrate concentration, with the thick red line being the drinking water standard. And if we look at our corn and soybean years, and I bracketed them together, look at how the majority of that data is above the drinking water standard. And this is taken at about 4 feet in the ground. Look at the green line. And the green line was in 2024 when we had oats on that farm. And it was the only year that we had 0 nitrate concentration within those lysimeter results. So when we think of the problem, we talk about unprotected corn and soybean acres. When we start talking about the solutions, it's breaking up that cropping rotation to get it to look more like it did in the past. And if we do have corn and soybean years, we need to get covers on them. So we need to grow corn and soybeans differently or raise something different than corn and soybeans. And I like this slide. I did it a long time ago, 2017, but it really matches well with the work that's been done in the Cannon watershed, because your data shows almost the exact same number, that if we put cover crops within row crops, we can reduce nitrates from 30 to 60%, depending on the height that we let those cover crops grow. This is one other example, happens to be my own well. Once I started living there and putting cover crops on that farm and putting oats, in this example, it was a 64% reduction in nitrate concentrations within the well itself. And in the nearby spring, it was a 50% reduction in nitrate concentration. So not just our county's data, which, Zach and Greg Klinger and Shona and everyone has helped gather this data, but in data across southern Minnesota, we see these same results. So I just want to talk about oats a little bit. Every good presentation has kids and dogs in it. And this was the first year that I grew oats. I would say it was oats 2.0. So in 2018, I grew about 7 or 8 acres of oats. This happens to be from 2020, skipped a year in there because of how wet it was in 2019. And I grew 40 acres of oats to see that I could grow them to a high enough test weight, grow them to a yield that I could make money on it, be able to combine them again. And that was the origin year of the of the oat mafia. So I and Kevin Conley and Tom Pifrone uh, first started the oat mafia. We strive to grow them no-till. We do not use glyphosate to desiccate, and we are working with Green Acres Milling, which is beyond the time frame of this presentation to get into the intricacies of why we started our own mill or why the oat mafia was so involved in Green Acres Milling. But it is so that we can produce our oats, and you as a consumer can go to the store and buy oats that you know was produced on Tom Pifrone's farm, Martin Larsen's farm, Landon Plagge's farm, right? So this is corn getting planted into that oat stubble. Most of the time we will use a legume. That legume is pretty effective in producing a lot more nitrogen than planting corn into a soybean crop. So we're getting about 40 to 60 pounds more of nitrogen from that legume crop than the soybean crop. This is no-tilling into that legume, that medium red clover. I happen to use what's called a stripper head, so I leave a lot of residue on the farm. If I'm not taking the straw, a lot of times I do, but that was to expedite oat harvest for me. If you see how that head works, it actually just takes the grain off the top of the plant and leaves the rest of the plant so that I don't have to run that whole plant through the combine. So when times are going good, that's a 28-foot head. I can go about 5 to 6 miles an hour and combine straight, as opposed to combining, taking in the whole plant. It's about 3 miles an hour. A little bit on caving. I just wanted to talk about some stories, experiences I've had as they relate to groundwater flow, and just kind of the unpredictability of karst. So I like to use that photo to grab people's attention. Sometimes we do this. It's called a near sump, where we put our nose to the ceiling of the cave to get through these areas that are nearly filled with water to get to where the cave opens up on the other side. So as I said, I was president for the Minnesota Caving Club for many years. Now I'm actually vice president because I just got too much going on in my life and I had to slow down a little bit. But the Minnesota Cave Preserve, which the Caving Club is part of, it has 42 caves. There's 605 surface acres and 1,274 subterranean acres of cave rights. There's a few caves listed here. There's Spring Valley Caverns, Coldwater Cave, Goliath, Tyson's, Bat River Cave, and Holy Grail Cave are the major cave systems. They're all over 2 miles long, with Coldwater being the longest, and that's actually in Iowa at 17.5 miles long. And talk on Holy Grail Cave because I think it's probably the most dynamic cave. I've seen it change the most in the years I've been caving. It floods very violently because it's connected to the York Blind Valley. Those are my caving club friends. John, who started the preserve, is in the lower left-hand side of the photo. And Holy Grail Cave was actually discovered as a result of a flood. So a short duration, high intense rainstorm that came in 2008. And we actually believe that the cave probably blew its top. So it created a sinkhole. You can see this sinkhole. This is the Discovery sinkhole. It's quite large, a gaping hole in the ground. That was about 45 feet from where John is standing there with the cable ladder to the floor of the cave. Actually, the landowner saw it, called the sheriff's department. There's a member of the sheriff's department, friends with John, called him and showed up to see what was at the bottom of this hole. And indeed, it was the over 4 mile cave that they found. And obviously, leaving a hole that size in the middle of a farm field or a CRP field was not a great idea. So they sealed the sinkhole at the time. They built a bridge over it, put a temporary entrance in it. And then Mark Tyne, drilled a new entrance, which is still exists today. Most of our entrances are like this one, where we have a 30-inch shaft. It's about 30 inches in diameter. Holy Grail Cave's entrance shaft is about 67 feet, 65, 67. The longest is, or the deepest is Coldwater Cave. That's 128 feet into the ground. There's a dye trace that I did in 2017 with John Berry from Department of Natural Resources and Calvin Alexander from the University of Minnesota. And if we look at this map here a little bit, it's a LiDAR photo, southern Fillmore County. All of the blue lines are completed dye traces, right? So if we look to the north of the York Blind Valley, that actually those are dye traces that go through Goliath's Cave and end up at the big spring that flows into Forestville State Park. And then if we look to the south, those dye traces through York Blind Valley and the Holy Grail Cave actually go over to Odessa Spring, with a little bit leaking out at Border Uprising. That's the little spur that comes out here south of the cave. So York Blind Valley in the red, that's a surface watershed that's approximately 11 3/4 square miles. So it's 7,520 acres. And right here is the York Blind Valley, where the red X is. And that water, unless there's a substantial flood, will not flow over the top of the Blind Valley. It has to go in the ground at that red X. Only a few times do folks alive today know of when that actually flooded to the degree that it could flow over the top of that Blind Valley. I mean, get out of that sinkhole. That's a Blind Valley, is a very large sinkhole that always has a stream flowing into it. And it actually creates a fairly large lake when it floods that violently. So we actually traced that water that entered the ground at the Blind Valley into Holy Grail Cave, which is about 6 miles away. Sorry, it's about 4 miles away, with the spring being about 7.5 miles away from York Blind Valley. So once the once the water flows through the lower levels of Holy Grail Cave, it comes out Odessa Spring, which is the largest known spring in the state of Minnesota. It's on the upper Iowa River. So if the water was to stay on the land surface instead of go in the ground, it would actually flow to the north and end up into the Root River watershed. But because it goes into York Blind Valley through Holy Grail Cave, it gets pirated out of the Root River and ends up in the upper Iowa River. This is a photo I took of John dumping the dye into the terminal sink right at the York Blind Valley. So that's a non-toxic dye. It's the same dye that we use in the medical field. It's also the same dye that dyes the Chicago River green. It's called fluorescein. So if we were to look at the map of Holy Grail Cave, I did not detect the dye in one area of the cave, but did in another area of the cave, which is the same area where I take that drip water sample from over here on the far east. It's called Falling Floor Pit. Well, we did see the water there, and that is the river. I went down into the water and swam in it, and I could actually see the continuation of the cave. We got a cave diver in it, and now this map actually extends on because the lower level has that river flowing in it. We were able to chase that river downstream. This sinkhole in the LiDAR, kind of in the center part of the cave here, that's actually the Discovery sinkhole. This older LiDAR flight was in 2009, and the sinkhole was not filled yet. So you can actually see that Discovery sinkhole right there. This is a photo of Odessa Spring. If we look at that farm field, again, you can see the Discovery sinkhole there, and we put the cave underneath it. You can see that there's only one sinkhole in that mapped sinkhole within that 40 acres. There's 4.4 miles of cave underneath it and only one mapped sinkhole. So a sinkhole presence or not doesn't always indicate that there may or may not be karst underneath it, right? So prior to 2008 in that flood, there would be no map sinkholes within that 440 acres. These are all the sinkholes that we can actually see within the cave itself. And here's a photo of one I took within the cave. We know it's a sinkhole because the cone collapse comes down into the cave. Water migrates there, so they're always wet. They're always typically a stream flowing away from them. So they are conduits that take surface water and start to move that deeper. And that may be surface water that's leached through the rooting system, right? Because if we look at like a Makokata or Dubuque limestone, there's actually layers of shale in it. So the water is going to move on top of that shale to find easier paths downward. So it's a little bit of a aquitard, those two bedrock units. So they'll move water down these open conduits that are now soil filled, and they're actually filled with glacial debris. So we call it driftless, but most of the Holy Grail sinkholes have glacial material in them. So rock from, igneous rock from Canada. Right here, that's me laying on my stomach holding a camera down a hole within about 50 feet of the road. And that's pretty significant. So Angela, my coworker, was there that day when we did an electrical resistivity image of this area. Because in that area and in that hole in front of me, if you were to fall down that hole, that's where you would end up. So on the left-hand side of the photo is inside the cave looking up, and the right-hand photo is where I was laying on the soil surface looking down. And that is to the cave floor. Let me see if I remember here. It's 85 feet to the floor of the cave. So you'd had a bad day if you were trespassing and didn't know that that hole wasn't just a gopher hole or a badger hole. It was only a couple basketball sizes in diameter, but you could fit through it. And that hole opened up on its own. We knew something was going on in that area of the cave because cave crickets, which are an insect and they typically like to hang out near entrances, we would find them in that moon and stars room. And then we found actually a dead raccoon on the floor of the moon and stars room, but it must not have quite opened up to the soil surface because we didn't see light until we were taking a new caver through, and she said that she could see light in that area. To be honest, nobody believed her till we went down, looked up, and saw this beam of light shining down into the cave. Went up on the surface, and I surveyed it. We used an excavator. In the red there, I hung off the excavator and rappelled all the way down through it. And I mapped it as I went down. So I had a rangefinder and a notebook. And there was a little bridge you could stand on about 42 feet down. 85 feet down was the floor of the main part of the cave. And then off to the southwest here, there's a crevice, and it's 125 feet to the static water table. So I have never seen anything like that in Minnesota before this or since then. And we actually plugged it the same way that John plugged the original Discovery Dome by building a bridge over it and then backfilling it. And right in the corner of this bridge are Rudy and I's handprints and the date. We embedded them in the cement. So if anybody ever digs it up again, it's us. Um, just a couple other things. This is Spring Valley Caverns. There's the Blind Valley that so it's similar to the York Blind Valley, but it's much smaller. It's a smaller blind valley. It always has a stream flowing through it. The BP or British Petroleum Pipeline actually crosses that area, and they've actually had to support that pipeline in that area by building a bridge under it because it keeps settling down. It's settled in 2004 or 5, I believe. They had to raise it up 5 feet. It had already sagged over 5 feet into the ground. Bat River Cave used to have the largest hibernating bat colony in the state, tri-state area. And we've been doing every other year bat count since. The last bat count we did was in 2023, and there were 24 bats of the original 4,112, which is the highest we ever found in 2011. And the reason that all of the bats or hibernaculum have disappeared is because of white nose. It's where ancient bones were discovered. It kind of rewrote the climatic history of this part of the state. There was a saber-toothed cat skull found, and within Tyson's cave, there was actually a stag moose antler. Goliath's cave is connected to the to Goliath sinkhole, or we also call that a blind valley. If I have time at the end, I can tell you a story about this photo in the upper right-hand corner about her dining room table. And before this cave was ever discovered, she swore to John and Dave Gerbeth that she knew the cave was underneath her, and she was in fact right when the cave was discovered. One last example. This was the most excruciating cave trip I've ever been on. It takes 16 hours of crawling to get to this area and back. We call it the long crawl. It's labeled here in the center. It is the only known place in the state of Minnesota where you can cross a watershed divide in the ground. So when you enter this passage, water is flowing out into the cave, this main trunk line of Tyson Spring Cave. And you can see the blue lines are the dye tracing that goes up to Tyson Spring. And this green dotted line is the approximate location of the groundwater divide, where the water starts to flow the other direction and actually flows to these other springs. We haven't dye traced it yet. It's on the list to do. It's just the fact that it's so difficult to get to this location. Nobody's really volunteering to go back there to carry the dye. This entire passage is about 4,500 feet long. It's never any taller than 24 inches, and it's always half filled with water. That's why it takes so long to get there. There's a couple of domes where you can stand up. They're about 80 feet tall, stand up, move around. But that is the most excruciating trip I've ever taken to survey that part of the cave, but also very unique because we discovered that spring shed boundary. So yeah, the connection that I've had to farming, to conservation, to nitrates, and the Karst system, it's something that I like really enjoy, like connecting all of that and telling this story of like why it matters to me and why, we as farmers need to be engaged in projects like Green Acres Milling so that we can get new markets for oats, so that we can help be part of the solution to groundwater pollution, specifically when we talk about nitrates. Um, but I really think that this crop diversity is the solution to that, because it's not like we're not cover crops work. I believe in them. I have my farm 2 out of the 3 years have cover crops on them, and the only year I don't is because I got to put oats on ground that does not have a cover crop. But I don't think that we will get cover crops widespread enough at this point quick enough to get nitrates reduced. More effective is to have a third crop that really addresses a lot of other concerns on the farm, like diversity, weed control, disease control, that also is good for nitrate reduction. So I think I can wrap it up there so we leave time for some questions.
Yeah, for sure. Ben, do you have a few wrap-up things you want to get to before we jump into questions?
I do. Let's see if there we go. All right, I will just quickly go over some of the why this. There we go. The programs that we have in the Cannon River. So here are the partners, so all the different counties and their soil and waters, and then our watershed is kind of divided into different priority areas. So it goes from level one being the most kind of highest priority down to three. And it takes different things to affect. Groundwater is one of them, and some of it's like slope, lakes, certain tributaries, that kind of thing. One of the main things that we fund that is non-structural that Martin was talking about was cover crops. So you can see here the funding changes depending on where you are in the watershed. So, and it does give more for a multi-species mix. So a lot of people just want to put down like winter rye or oats or something, and then it's kind of dead by the end of fall. But if you do multiple species and let it grow, then there's usually one that can overwinter. Those pay a little better to producers in the area. And then we also fund no-till, strip-till sort of practices just to kind of get people to stop disturbing the soil so much. And it's the same thing with priority levels. And then priority crops, or not priority, perennial crops. This is one that it's not used very much because it excludes alfalfa and pasture, but there are a handful of people that will do different clovers and intermediate wheatgrass, which is like kernza. We have a couple people plant those, and they can be harvested, but then they come back every year. And then there are also federal and state programs that kind of go into conservation cover. So one that I know Martin talked about, like CRP. So that is a very popular program in our area where kind of used to be called like set aside acres, where someone will put aside some of their cropland and put it into native grasses, flowers, that kind of thing. And it's there for usually most of them are a minimum of 10 years. But some people, it's been in there for 30, 40 years. They just re-enroll it over and over again, and they get money from the federal government, kind of renting their land to the government in the name of conservation. Now to the things that kind of have more to do with what we're talking about today. One thing that we definitely like to fund is residential well sealing. So there's lots of times where someone has a well on their property and it breaks or it doesn't work as well or it's contaminated or it's just old for any of those reasons. And those are things that we like to see get sealed. So kind of like when Martin was talking about how the cracks in the ground and then water can get down lower. An old well can definitely be a source of contamination from surface water down into the groundwater. And so if you're in level one or two, and the priority, we don't worry about that too much right now, but it's usually funded 100% up to $3,000. And sometimes they can get really expensive depending on what kind of well it is to seal them, but usually they fall around in there. So it's not too expensive, and it's always kind of a very easy thing to do that is good for groundwater. And then well testing. So if I don't know if any of you on here have private wells, probably some of you. We do fund different private well testing. So different counties will do it. And the five things, so nitrates is the big contaminant that's kind of the hot button issue right now. But there also is bacteria that you want to test for, arsenic, lead, and manganese. Those are kind of the big five. Nitrates and bacteria, ideally, you want to test for those every year because they can change a little quicker. Arsenic, lead, and manganese, if you do it, they sometimes say at least once with your well, but 5, 10 years, something like that. Those levels usually don't fluctuate as much as the bacteria and nitrates. And like I had said earlier, there's usually nitrate, especially nitrates, but even other contaminant clinics around the watershed. But you would just want to contact your local soil and water to see what's going on. And like in Goodhue County here, we house a nitrate spectrophotometer to test for nitrates from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And so I'll lend that out to a bunch of other counties, especially at fairs, to do nitrate testing clinics. And then if you are in the far southeast side of the watershed, or if you're even not in the Cannon River watershed, the Tap In program will fund free tests for anyone who's in those 8 counties right there. Unfortunately, Rice is not in there, and they're a big part of the Cannon River watershed, but they are included to alleviate any contaminants. So RO systems are very popular, especially for nitrates. And there is funding available to Rice County and those other 8 counties through this one. So if you are in any of those 8 counties and you have a private well and you would like to get it tested, you can order it online. They'll send a box to your house and you just mail it in. Or you can, like I said, contact your local soil and water and they'll kind of point you in the right direction. Yeah, awesome.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. We do have a handful of questions here to get through. Ben, since I have you on here, there's a
Yeah.
couple kind of directed towards you. Somebody was wondering if there was dollar amounts for various programs for reducing erosion and pollution. Not ex
There's not like specific dollar amounts. So the erosion one, it's a cost share sort of setup. So somebody wants to put in a basin in their field to prevent erosion. They would do that, hire a contractor, and then there would be cost share involved. And that can fluctuate from 50%, 75%, 90% cost share, depending on what priority level you are in. So yeah, there are, and the pools of money are gigantic. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it's a cost share thing. So it's not paying people to do this stuff. It's just helping them with the cost of these erosion and pollution control measures.
Perfect. All right, Martin, are you ready for a barrage of questions?
I am. Do you want me to just read them and I can go, I mean, out
Yeah,
of the
what
Q&A? Yep.
Yeah, whatever's
Yeah.
easiest for you.
Yep.
Like that
Yep.
first one with the data center, I don't
Yep.
know if you have a lot to offer on that. It's not really germane to this conversation, but if you have some information, feel free to answer that one as well.
Yeah. So I guess the only thing I would, that water usage question, I don't, it's not going to be a contributor of pollutants into the groundwater, but with the water usage, like the more the region starts to draw water, the hydraulic pressure will pull younger water deeper into the aquifers. Now we have aquatards, which are, we don't call them confining layers anymore, because they do not 100% confine. So if you're pumping water from deeper aquifers, the hydraulic pressure will push younger water, which has higher nitrate concentrations in it generally, into deeper water aquifers. So it could expedite that process of moving higher concentrated water deeper, right? So I I'm just speaking out of, my knowledge of pumping and hydraulics and whatever. I have not studied that. That's my disclaimer. I'm not sure if we would ever, at this point in the near future, have, data good enough to say that this is a legitimate reason to push back on that kind of water usage. But I would challenge everyone to look up, the water appropriations permits that the state has available to the public. You can Google that. You can go on the maps. You can see where those wells are, how much they dewater, because some quarries actually dewell or dewater a lot of water, more than cities do, a single quarry. So just my knowledge on water usage, I would be concerned about the um, and then of course the discharge too. Where is it? If it's a pump and dump system, where is it going once it's dumped, right? But that amount of pumping water. Um, okay, so where to find these studies? That is something that we need to do better about. So um, this Q&A is, I would love to look up some of the studies as mentioned. I spent a fair amount of time learning about this topic, and a lot of it is new. So we do not do very good. I do not do very good, nor do other state agencies and folks that study this. We do not have a good data center for, because we just talked about it. I'm using that as a joke. A data warehouse for these nitrate studies. Um, so the best way that I know of now is to contact the individuals. Some of it is getting housed on the University of Minnesota's um, data warehousing avenues. So like the Minnesota groundwater tracing database, that's all up there. And I know some of the other papers in that I've done are there. Um, so that just prior to COVID, we assembled a group, a meeting of everyone who works on nitrates in Minnesota. And that was one thing that came out of it, and it kind of fizzled out over COVID. And we really got to get that going again of like, we need to house this data better. And of course, the challenge is like when you have data, like how is it like mine, like if I have a nitrate concentration, that's what the lab stores. So you could get that out of our office, right? But the most valuable part to me is what's it connected to? Is it connected to a land use, or where is it and when was it taken and what aquifer, and like all these other details that starts to point to, you know, real answers on our nitrate dilemmas, right? Oat Mafia t-shirts, we're coming with them. I had stickers made. I think Mary Nesberg from U of M Extension, she's going to work on getting some t-shirts. I know you can get Green Acres Milling swag from their website. And I know whenever we get mine or we get this Oat Mafia stuff, we're probably going to throw it on the Green Acres Milling website as well. So I'd look there. Um, Flow and turnover rate for the aquifers really depends on how deep they are. The upper carbonates, so like if I look at like cave drips, and these were studies that I didn't include in this presentation. I have one that's pretty long going at uh, um, Spring Valley Caverns, where it was a cornfield, and then the cornfield changed to a hay field. And I've about once every 2 years, I've been taking a water sample there to see how long it takes for nitrates to adjust to the hayfield. So it appears that in this upper carbonate aquifer, and there's other studies too, there's the Northeast Rochester Stonehenge well, that it takes about 3 to 5 years for the initial response. And then there's a trailing limb that can last, many decades. So that's that. There's some very young water that could be 3 to 5 years, and very old water where the deeper aquifers could be 50 years lag time, right? So, or more. How long did the dye take to be detected after initially pouring it into the water? So that was in Holy Grail Cave. I only was able to go back to that cave once a week. So it was detected within the first week we used. And this report is found online. So you can go to Minnesota Groundwater Tracing Database. You can find that report when you look in Fillmore County. It talks about this. We actually use charcoal detectors where the fluorescent dye sticks to the charcoal. So it adsorbs to the charcoal. You use a slightly acidic solution to release it. And then we use a spectrophorophotometer, which actually uses spectrometry to look at that sample and determine if the dye is present. I've seen other dye traces in the state where it will travel many miles per day underground. So if you're really interested in this, read those reports on a evening while you're or a morning while drinking your coffee. Um, how did we seal the sinkholes with a bridge? We actually went to there's a bridge contractor in the town of Harmony. It's Minoa Construction. And I went on site and found steel that was from a recycled bridge, and they delivered it. And we set these steel girders or steel beams down over the sinkhole. If you look at that photo where the cement was poured, that was actually about a 12-foot um, excavation we did to get down to competent or solid bedrock. We laid that steel over the void and then put forms or concrete forms on top of that. I built them out of plywood, 3/4 inch plywood, put rebar in it, and then poured the cement. Overall, what determinations and conclusions regarding Karst agriculture and water interactions? Um, Conclusions. We got to raise corn and soybeans differently or raise something different than corn and soybeans if we're going to make headway on nitrate reductions. It's the way it is. I can't find a different option right now. I guess
Yeah,
that,
I think that, that cave drip study that you showed, I think, that those results, I think that almost kind of just speaks to that question really well. That was really interesting to see the different results versus what the land management above was looking like. So,
yep, yep. And another conclusion that I have is um, if we look at pesticide data, also like if we're growing oats as compared to corn, the amount of pesticides we spray on that oats is like subfractional. I mean, it's so much less. So is it organic? No, it's not, but it's so much in the right direction that that's where it's something to really, elevate, right? So are CRP lands as valuable as oats in lowering? I think CRP is actually a little more effective than oats um, because it's long term and it is near zero or as close to zero as detection as we can get on our landscape. So CRP is very effective. What percentage of nitrates in groundwater come from commercial agriculture versus other sources? I know this number is out there. Um, I'm going to be a little bit guarded with the answer, but I can say that it's 80% or higher, 80 to 90. But I know that number is out there, but it depends on the region, right? So if we were in rural Fillmore County, like the loading is predominantly agriculture. There is some loading from private septic systems, although we've moved that so far forward with new septic systems and replacing old ones and underperforming. There is some nitrate contribution from cities, obviously. But if you look at the lysimeter network, Pollution Control Agency headed that up. If you look at their golf course data versus lawns and that it's actually quite a bit lower even in a golf course compared to an ag field or a corn field, right? It's not zero. Um, so we can't say that it's a zero source, but also you need to look at like in Southeast Minnesota, how many acres of golf course are there, right? As to how many acres of corn are there. Um, so very safely say 80% of high or higher, but I know that number's out there. I just don't have it, in hand here to say this is the number that data has pointed to, right? So a little bit of a disclaimer there. In addition to corn and soybeans, what about feedlots? Yes, feedlots can be a source of nitrates into groundwater. It depends on the features of the feedlot, whether is it a cement floor, is it a dirt floor feedlot? Um, how close is it to bedrock? Does it have a treatment system that's been upgraded? So I've worked on in Olmsted County, I think 5 or 6 well-designed uh, buffer areas for feedlots, and they're designed with by size and separation distance to bedrock so that the vegetation can uptake that nitrate that leaves the feedlot surface. But it's like everything, whether it's ag land or feedlot, or a private septic system, the better managed it is, the less imprint it will have. So a well-managed feedlot that's cleaned often, where manure is stored properly, applied properly to the ag land. There's a lot of grazing associated with it. Maybe they grow a lot of hay to feed to those cattle. That system is rock star system. But if it's poorly managed, that there's runoff, it's close to bedrock, it's not cleaned often enough, manure storage is out of date and poorly performing, and manure application is handled poorly, you're going to have an imprint, or you're going to affect nitrates. Same with a STS system, septic treatment system. If you got a straight pipe, if you got what are the old cesspools or whatever, haven't updated it, you're putting nitrates in the groundwater.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for questions, Martin. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge sharing with everybody. I definitely learned something. I thought that picture of that alfalfa field was really interesting in that drought year. That was neat that you got that shot. So,
Yeah, that was kind of a, well, since then we haven't had conditions that create that. So I was driving down the road and I saw that. I'm like, oh, I got to get Aaron Gam took the photo, so it really I like that kind of stuff that represents the bigger picture, just like the cave drip photos, right? Like we can get buried in data all day long, but we really got to know the bigger picture. So thanks.
yeah, yeah. Well, we'll wrap it up here. Thank you everybody for your time. And for those who were registered, you'll get a copy of the link to the recording here as we get it wrapped up. And we look forward to seeing everybody next month for our next talk on aquatic invasive species. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next time.